Hello all and welcome back to Intro to American Studies. This week's reading is about the welfare rights movement in the late 1960s. And I chose this reading because it reminded me so much of the debates that have been going on right now about what sort of economic support the government should supply to people who are unemployed or otherwise financially struggling due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Even before the pandemic, you may recall there was a Democratic candidate for president, Andrew Yang, who ran on the idea of the universal basic income, which is the idea that every citizen of the US should get a basic annual income regardless of the work that they do or do not do, that ensures that they don't fall into abject poverty. And Yang pushed this because of his belief that the automation of work through robotics is going to dramatically decrease the amount of jobs available in the near future. So this was before the pandemic had occurred or was even on anyone's radar. But just to give another example of how, even before the pandemic, this idea of whether everyone should just receive a basic amount of money from the government, or just how can the government or should the government prevent people from falling into poverty, right, has been a discussion. And the pandemic, I feel like, really just made that discussion so much more urgent because of the vastly increased number of people who are now struggling financially. So, Yang, of course, did not do particularly well in the Democratic primary. He's actually now running for mayor of New York, which is kind of bizarre in my opinion, but we'll see what happens with that. But anyway, once the pandemic hit, this idea of having some sort of guaranteed income became much more popular because suddenly so many more people were out of work. And so we have seen a few policies thus far that have addressed this. So in the sort of early stimulus bills, there was a temporary increase in the amount of unemployment benefits. So and it was a pretty significant, like several hundred more dollars a week that people would get in unemployment benefits. And all citizens were supposed to get a $1,200 check back in the spring. And this is probably the closest thing to the idea, right, of a universal basic income, right? Every single person, granted you have to be a citizen and there are complications around that, but the idea being every single citizen, regardless of the work you do or do not do, regardless of your income, even in this case, I think there was, somewhat of an income cap, but pretty much everyone, just got $1,200, right? And so that's, an example of kind of one of these ideas that have been swimming around policy-wise, again, even before the pandemic, as ways to alleviate poverty. And there is, at this moment, if you've been following the news, a major stimulus bill that the president is likely to sign. He may have signed it by the time that you watch this video, which repeats these tactics of an increase in unemployment benefits and checks, as well as it adds significant tax cuts for various sorts of tax cuts for people below certain income. However, even under the case of the pandemic, these policies have been extremely controversial, and this latest bill barely passed in the divided Senate. So Pramila Nadasen, the author of this week's chapter, writes about somewhat similar proposals that were put forth in the late 1960s, but these proposals were put forward not in response to a pandemic, but simply in response to growing unemployment and poverty. So to give you some of that context, in the late 1960s, while the civil rights movement had achieved some important legislative victories, like the Voting Rights Act, the material conditions of many Black Americans and other just marginalized groups had not substantively improved. And by material conditions, I mean the basics of how people are able or not able to live their lives. So In fact, in the late 60s, poverty was getting worse, unemployment was getting worse, racial segregation was getting worse in cities, and police brutality was escalating. And all of this is happening primarily in cities in the North and the West, which are at that same time, not coincidentally, increasing their percentage of Black and brown residents. And so in the midst of growing poverty, growing unemployment, worsening segregation, single mothers who received welfare, who were mostly women of color, banded together to form an organization called the National Welfare Rights Organization, or the NWRO. Now, welfare is a broad term that has been used to describe a number of policies. So in the 1960s, welfare was officially called Aid for Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC, and it had started in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression. So, again, somewhat similar to now, but not identical, right? In the Depression, you had this huge economic crisis, and suddenly millions and millions of Americans are out of work, and the government decides to respond with significant economic stimuli, which as a group were known as the New Deal, which you may hear people continue to reference today, most commonly in the Green New Deal. People call for kind of a similar sort of government response. So what we know as welfare comes out of this New Deal response to the Great Depression. So there wasn't the pandemic piece going on, but it was in response to a massive economic crisis. So that's where welfare originally comes from. And it was called, in the 1960s, Aid for Families with Dependent Children. And that program focused on providing single mothers a very minimal amount of monthly financial support. So you had to be single, you had to be a mother, and regardless, it wasn't a lot of money. But by the late 1960s, it was clear to pretty much everyone, Democrats and Republicans, that poverty was getting worse, social unrest was growing due to both racism and poverty, right? You have uprisings in cities all over the country, including Newark. And that therefore increasing the amount and availability of welfare payments was a way to address these problems. So there are two major ways that this chapter expanded my understanding of America. So one is the existence of the welfare rights movement in and of itself. So generally, when we learn about the civil rights movement, we focus on middle-class Black men like Martin Luther King Jr., sometimes middle-class women like Rosa Parks. But Nadasen shows how a major political force in the civil rights movement was also poor single mothers of color. And secondly, she shows how for a brief moment in the late 1960s and early 1970s, politicians across the ideological spectrum, conservatives and progressives, agreed that the federal government should invest large amounts of money to address growing poverty, and that poor people should be a part of creating that solution, right? Who should be involved in putting these policies together. And I gotta say, I never would have believed that particularly a conservative Republican administration would have supported expanding welfare and working with poor people on policy. You know, given the current political dynamics, that seems quite hard to imagine. Even liberal Democratic administrations have attacked and cut welfare, right? Welfare is not really a popular policy anymore and hasn't been for quite some time, which is part of the history that Nadasen, is laying out. So the most notorious cuts to welfare were actually passed during the Democratic Clinton administration in the 1990s, and this is when aid to families with dependent children was changed to the current welfare program, which is called Temporary Aid to Needy Families, or TANF, TANF. So people who receive welfare today are technically receiving temporary aid to needy families, and you can see with the word temporary added to that new title that there was this goal in the 1990s to get folks off of welfare as soon as possible, right? They felt like welfare had gotten too big and they needed to cut the rolls, get people back to work, so to speak. But Nadasen is revealing this moment earlier in the late 1960s when most people supported expanding welfare, when welfare was arguably a popular policy for a brief moment. And it opened my eyes really to just, in general, how much policy debates can change over time. So that when we talk today about, this is what the Democratic Party stands for, this is what the Republican Party stands for, or even, this is what conservatives believe, this is what progressives believe, those things are all really only accurate within the contemporary context, right? And we have to look very carefully if we want to say something about these policy debates and these various political positions in the past, because they've changed. I mean, the late 1960s is 50 years ago, so that wasn't that long ago that there were actually quite different policy debates around welfare. So Nadasen tells this story about how the National Welfare Rights Organization came up with their ideal welfare plan, which was a payment of $5,500 a year, which in today's money sounds like not much, but actually I looked up online the inflation calculator, and it's about $40,000 a year in today's dollars, which is actually not a bad salary. So it was a pretty generous annual payment for people who needed it, and it was for anyone below a certain income level, regardless of family composition. So you could be, a single person without kids, you could be a couple without kids, you could be a couple with kids, you could be a single parent. So it wasn't limited just to single mothers, right? It was for anyone who needed it, and it included work incentives rather than requirements, meaning that you would get more money. Like overall, you would earn more money if you worked, if you had a job, in addition to this receiving the money from this plan. But you would still get some money even if you didn't work. And this has always been a very controversial aspect of these programs. So that was the National Welfare Rights Organization's ideal plan that they proposed in the late 1960s. And in response, the Nixon administration came up with its own plan. So Richard Nixon was the president at the time. And their plan was called the Family Assistance Plan, or FAP, which was a much lower amount, so only $1,600 a year, which in today's dollars is about $11,000. So that's, below the poverty line in today's dollars. And it also prioritized two-parent families and had a mandatory work requirement. So you had to work, and you had to be a family with children. And if both parents were in the home, you would receive sort of the maximum amount, basically. And the National Welfare Rights Organization opposed Nixon's plan because they said it was too little money. And they debated this issue of prioritizing two-parent families and having work requirements. And so here's where we get to why we're reading this in this unit on gender and sexuality, right? You might be like, yeah, this is all very interesting, but what does this have to do with gender, sexuality, intersectionality? Well, here, right, is where we get to the heart of it. So the National Welfare Rights Organization was primarily made up of single mothers who received welfare. But most of the leadership of the organization were middle-class men who did not receive welfare. So already there you see the gender and class issue of who has power, right, in general, in political organizing. Even though it's a welfare rights organization, still middle-class people who are men, who are not on welfare, are in power in the welfare rights organization. And even though these men and women were working together to increase welfare support, right? So these men do believe in the need to increase welfare. That's why they work for this organization. They often had very different views about who and what welfare was for. So women NWRO organizers generally believed that a guaranteed annual income was especially important for women's economic independence. So it was important to them that the policy did not penalize single mothers for being single parents, and that it did not force single mothers to leave their children to go outside of the home to work. They believed that motherhood was a full-time job and deserving of an income. On the other hand, Men NWRO organizers generally believed that a guaranteed annual income was primarily to support unemployed men to raise their families while they were looking for work. And they were not as interested in providing women with the economic freedom to raise children by themselves. So you can see how this issue becomes a gender issue very quickly, right? Are we interested in allowing women to survive as single full-time mothers? And therefore then that income is for work in a sense, right? It's for the work of raising children, of being a mother, right? Or are we trying to force perhaps or encourage those women to find a partner, right? They need to find a man, right, who then will make them a quote-unquote complete family, who then, right, deserve to receive a certain amount of income, but only while the man is looking for a job, right? And then it's the man's responsibility to have a job and support his partner and children, right? So this idea of what's kind of an ideal family or even the right kind of family is really what's being debated, or really I would say is some of the underlying, right, issues that are being debated when we're talking about things like welfare. And Nadasen argues that these ideas about gender and their intersection with ideas about race, particularly regarding Black women, are what ultimately led to the failure of welfare expansion and the guaranteed annual income. Because again, she's telling us how these were incredibly popular policies, right? This was a popular idea to expand it, even if you expanded it a little bit or a lot bit, but it didn't happen. And she's saying that this is because of the intersection, right, of sexism and racism, particularly against Black women. So, even though the majority of people who received welfare, both then and now, are white, many Americans associated welfare with single Black mothers, and they had racist and sexist ideas of single Black mothers as lazy and undeserving of government assistance. And Nadasen shares this both amazing and horrifying quotation from a senator who opposed even Nixon's more limited plan because, quote, "I can't get anybody to iron my shirts," which shows how he believed that Black women should put their kids in daycare so they could go and serve as low-wage domestic workers and iron his shirts, right? So again, in his mind, it's inappropriate for the government to provide a single Black mother with an income so she can stay home and raise her kids, because in his mind, it's better for her to go work at these menial domestic jobs, right? I feel like I could say so much more about this. It's got so many layers and it's so complex and so, I think, still related to these debates today, right? When we're debating even who should get stimulus checks during the pandemic, right? It makes me wonder, well, how much do those debates have to do with racist and sexist stereotypes of people, with the fact that disproportionately people who have lost their jobs during the pandemic have been Black and brown and have been women, right? And so how does that shape people's ideas of who is deserving of support during the pandemic? So these are all just things to kind of think about as you're reading Nadasen and as you're reflecting on it. So those are my thoughts on Nadasen and the welfare rights movement. It's definitely a generally overlooked aspect of the broader civil rights movement, and I hope it opened your eyes to the intersectional race and gender and sex and class aspects of government welfare policy. As usual, your reflections are due Sunday by midnight, and I hope you all enjoy your spring break.